like to just begin by acknowledging many people. The Poshan Community Studies is a study that's gone on for 4 years in Nepal. It started in 2013, went to 2016. It was implemented by Johns Hopkins University, by New Era, under the Nutrition Innovation Lab. And a lot of blood, sweat, and tears goes into collecting all of the data that we present. And so I just want to acknowledge all of the enumerators who carried around height boards in the field. It's very hard work. And everybody who went into designing the study, as well as my co-authors here and USAID for funding. So one of the really interesting things about this session is that we're all examining diet, but we're examining it in different ways. And so my presentation is focused on examining dietary patterns, which is a slightly different way of constructing this, looking at diet. So you've seen people examine diet in terms of the individual food groups. But of course, the reality is when people eat diets, they eat it in dietary patterns, right? Not just individual foods, not nutrients, it's dietary patterns. And so that's the way that I'm trying to look at this. So an advantage of dietary patterns is that it reflects the way that people actually eat food. It also allows for nutrient-nutrient interactions, which can be very complicated. There's different approaches to analyzing dietary data, and so most dietary pattern papers look at a priori dietary patterns. And an example would be like the Mediterranean diet that you can analyze and say a priori this percent of the population ate the Mediterranean diet, and these are the health benefits. This is a little bit different. This is working with the dietary data that we collected. We use a method that allows us to determine what the patterns are that already exist in the population. And few studies from Nepal have characterized diets in this way. The downside is that it is a lot more complicated than other types of analysis. It's quite a sophisticated thing, but there's a lot of statistical packages now that enable you to do this. So we're actually using the 2016 round of the Poshan study data. The objectives were to describe the dietary patterns of women in Nepal, to characterize the factors that are associated with different dietary patterns, and really to test this hypothesis that Nepal, we know, is a very heterogeneous society. It's a very heterogeneous country, and people eat very diverse diets. And to test the hypothesis that there's not just one diet in Nepal. There's a lot of diets, and they're probably driven by many different factors, both economic, cultural, et cetera. So just a little bit about the sampling and the method. So this is a nationally representative survey, and it's also a survey that's representative in each of the 3 zones in Nepal, the mountains, the hills, and the Terai. There were 7 VDCs selected per zone with 3 wards per VDC. And one difference with this study compared to, say, the DHS is that at the final level, at that ward level, all of the households were enumerated to identify eligible households. And the eligibility criteria included households with a young child, less than 5 years of age, as well as households with a newly married woman, because those women will probably be having babies soon. This analysis includes 5,830 women of reproductive age. So there was a 7-day food frequency tool that was administered, including 48 frequently consumed foods available in the food system. The method that I used, there's a limited number of sort of inputs you can use for it, so I had to reduce those foods to 12 food groups. The method that I used is called latent class analysis, and basically what you do is you put the input, which is for each food group I categorize an individual into low, medium, or high consumption at the bottom 20th percentile and the upper 80th percentile. And so you put it in, and then basically what you get out is it allocates women into one of the different dietary patterns. Another advantage of this method compared to other methods is that you can adjust for different things. And so we know that during festivals, people eat differently in Nepal, during Dasai and Tihar, et cetera. So I was able to adjust for those festivals, when generating these dietary patterns. You choose, the computer can sort of spit out 13 patterns, it could spit out 3 patterns. You have to use a method to determine what's the best fit. And so we just examined a number of goodness of fit indices to be able to determine that the best fit in this case was 7 dietary patterns for the country. And then I used just the chi-square test to test the statistical significance, looking at different characteristics of dietary patterns. So here you can see the different food groups and the different individual foods that were included in there within each food group. So you can have a quick look at that. So I'll be talking more about those 12 food groups and what's inside of them. Okay. So just a little bit of background information about the population. About 60% of the population was in the Terai, about 25% in the hills, and about 15% in the mountains. About 20% of the population was found to be food insecure using the Household Food Insecurity Access Score. Just looking at a few of the castes of note, Brahmin Kshetris were about 25% of the population, and then some of the castes, lower castes, including the Pahadi Dalit, was about 9%, and Terai Dalit was 6.6%. About 20% of the population had low BMI, defined as a BMI, body mass index, less than 18.5, and about 15% was either overweight or obese. So before I get into the dietary patterns, just a picture of the national status. As Dr. West said yesterday, I think in general dietary diversity in Nepal is quite poor. We saw a median fruit consumption of any type of fruit of 3 times. It's very skewed. There's a lot of zeros when you look at the dietary data. About 25% of the population didn't have any fruit consumption in the past 7 days. Vegetable consumption, the median was about 12 in the past 7 days, and only 10% of women consumed fruit or vegetables 5 times per day. It's often used, the 5 times per day is you often hear in a lot of countries. Dairy consumption was dairy was the most consumed animal source food. I think a lot of it came in the form of milk, tea, chia. Meat, the median consumption was only 1 time in the last 7 days, and eggs were not really consumed much at all. So as I said, there were 7 dietary patterns that were generated, and you can see the prevalence of each of those different dietary patterns there. I described them based on sort of just looking at, what the predominant foods were that were consumed. And I sorted them from the most diverse diets to the least diverse diets for the purpose of sort of being able to look at them neatly. You can see that they range from just 4% for that pattern number 3, all the way up to 22% for pattern number 6, which is a low moderate dietary diversity. So here you can see fruit and vegetable consumption by dietary pattern. And sort of reiterating what some of the previous presenters have said, there's actually a lot of variation. And there's variation, in the consumption of each of these by dietary patterns. So I think this definitely supports the argument that there is not just one dietary pattern in Nepal. If you look at the most diverse, you see considerable consumption of other vegetables. It's about 18%. And you can see that it's much lower for other ones. If you look at the patterns 5 to 7, they're the least diverse diets. There's virtually no consumption of fruit at all, right? And again, that statistic of 5 fruits or vegetables per day, you see that in group number 1, about 30% of the population consumed 5 fruits or vegetables per day, but that's much lower in all of the other dietary patterns. If you look at animal source food consumption, which we talked about a lot so far, as I said, milk is the predominant food that's consumed, and you can see that the median number of times that was consumed per day for the first 4 dietary patterns, ranged from about 6 up to 12 times in the last 7 days. But you see very little milk consumed by those who fall in the least dietary diverse patterns. I think eggs and meat, really the only pattern that has milk, eggs, and meat in the same pattern are those who are following pattern number 1 and a little bit in pattern number 4, the moderate pattern. Other foods, and this sort of supports what Dr. Shively was saying earlier. When you look at staple foods, the frequency, there are some differences across dietary patterns, but there's definitely a stability there across all of those patterns in terms of staple foods, pulses, and oils. So there's not a lot of variation. You do see that, for example, under pattern number 6, even though it's a very non-diverse dietary pattern, they do have a considerable frequency of staple foods, and perhaps that's filling that gap. And processed foods are consumed by everybody in all dietary patterns, but not actually consumed as much as I would have thought. And then by zone. So this is interesting. So you see a lot of variation. As Dr. Shively said, geography determines diets. And so you can see patterns 2 and 6 appear to be much more prevalent among those in the Terai. So overall, about 58% of the population lived in the Terai. You can see that they're disproportionately represented under diets 2 and 6. Whereas pattern number 3, which was only about 4% of the population, was clearly found predominantly among those in the hills. Patterns number 1 and 5 appeared to be present in both the mountains and the hills. And then 7 appeared to sort of, both 4 and 7 appeared to be sort of distributed across all 3 zones in equal amounts proportionate to how many are in our sample. So those may be like national dietary patterns. Looking at it by food insecurity, you can definitely see that those who are in the more diverse patterns tended to have low food insecurity, and those who were more food insecure tended to be in those less dietary, tended to adhere to the patterns that were less diverse. And looking at it by underweight and overweight of the women, you can see interesting patterns here as well. So as I said, about 15% of the population was overweight. And you can see that those who were in pattern number 1, about 25%, even 27% were overweight. And so people with the most diverse diets are also those who are overweight. You can see that patterns 6 and 7 have a high prevalence of underweight, and so those are the monotonous diets as well. You can see more sort of balance among those following patterns number 4 and 5, and a lot more underweight, interestingly, in that pattern number 3. Looking at it by wealth, wealth is clearly associated with dietary quality, and so those who are in the top quintile, that's shown in blue, tended much more to be consuming a diverse diet following patterns 1 and 2 and 4. Those who were poorer in the bottom quintile of household expenditure, or in the bottom quintile of our wealth score, tended to be consuming much more of a monotonous diet. And then I also looked at it by certain caste groups just to see the extent to which that might also represent a factor. And indeed it does. So you can see that there are much more Brahmins and Kshatris following the much more diverse patterns number 1 and 2. As I said, I think the Pahadi number 3 is definitely a diet that's found in the hills, and you can see that represented there. And you can see that 6 seems to have a lot more Terai, Dalit consuming that pattern. So just a few conclusions. I think the evidence really definitely supports the hypothesis that diets in Nepal are very heterogeneous, and they vary by agroecological zone, by socioeconomic status, by nutritional status, and other factors. I think that this type of an approach can be a useful way of complementing some of the other approaches like dietary diversity scores, because people do eat diets, and I think it reflects that. It can also be used to guide interventions. I think that future work could examine how these diets may be changing over time. It would be interesting to incorporate this into, for example, a dietary change, behavior change communication intervention to see to what extent we could try to change some of these diets through behavior and shift some of these dietary patterns. So that's my presentation. Thank you all very much for your attention.